we do have these systems. We do sort of have these architectures in place, and we need good regulations around them. We can't treat these things as inevitabilities. Like climate is big, but these hazards that come along are all things that we should be controlling. And workers are counting on employers to control. Like there is a requirement that employers control hazards in the workplace, and this is no different from any other kind of hazard.
Welcome to Class and Climate, a podcast where the end of the world meets the end of the month. I'm your host, Emma Thompson. If you study climate science or climate politics at all, you probably know the word stochastic. We know that climate change leads to increased incidence of extreme weather events, hazards, and disasters. We know that the trend rises generally, but the exact time and location and severity is largely probabilistic. And that creates some real problems for climate adaptation. It's especially troubling for the workers on the front lines. Heat stress, workplace air pollution, vector-borne diseases are all big risks to workers' health. They are all exacerbated by climate change, but none of them are well regulated by Canada's occupational health and safety laws. And there's no real standard practice from employer to employer about how to deal with these risks or the increased incidence of these chronic problems. Today, we are bringing you a panel we hosted on May Day, May 1st, on workers' health and safety in the age of climate catastrophe, hosted by myself. Yeah, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the Green Economy Network's May Day webinar and May membership meeting. Green Economy Network is an alliance of unions and environmental NGOs advocating for a worker-led and community-led response to the ecological crisis. And I think its relevance to today's subject is kind of self-evident. That the climate crisis isn't just a technical crisis. It's not just a question of meteorology, or it's not a statistical problem. But it is a crisis at the core of our mode of production and consumption. You know, where while the crisis does threaten all life on Earth nominally, it doesn't threaten rich and poor equally, right? There's a difference between how the climate crisis is going to impact the Jeff Bezos and the Elon Musk of the world who can go to space versus those of us who have one home, one place to live, one set workplace. Particularly if we're stuck working outdoors or working in places prone to overheating, places at risk of a stochastic extreme weather event where, you know, the event might be stochastic, but our ability to relocate is pretty static. So today we're placing a special focus on how the climate crisis affects frontline workers and how it is that workers can best protect themselves and protect each other in this crisis. You know, and I think it raises central questions of power in the workplace, power at the point of production, and the fight broadly to put people and planet over profit. So our panelists today are experts in the intersection of climate science and occupational health. And today we're going to discuss what laws exist to protect workers from climate-related hazards, where the laws fall short, and where collective bargaining and social policy can step up and intervene. I think to start, maybe I'm going to just ask each of the panelists to maybe introduce yourselves and discuss a little bit about where you think we're at with the question of workers' health and safety and in regards to kind of climate-related risks.
Sure, thanks, Em. Hello, everybody. Very happy to be here. This is the nexus of two passions for me, that being obviously health and safety and the world of environment in general, and more specifically, the impact of climate change on our world. Very briefly, a little bit about me. I'm the President and CEO for the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety. Most people know us as CCOHS. Along with health and safety, I have a background in environment and sustainability with degrees in chemistry and chemical engineering. For those of you who may not be familiar with CCOHS, we are Canada's trusted source for credible occupational health and safety information. We're a large part of what we do is help Canadians increase their awareness of health and safety in the workplace. And we do this by a variety of online means, with free resources. We have websites dedicated to advancing workplace health and safety. Our focus is on prevention practices, ensuring employers, managers, and workers have information they need to work safely. We are a federal departmental corporation, so essentially an element of the federal government, but we are very much arm's length from the federal government. We're located in Hamilton. That's where all the magic happens, but just about everything is that we do is accessible via our website, other than obviously gatherings like these and conferences and what have you. Our website, ccohs.ca or cchst.ca if you want the French version. Everything we do is bilingual. Welcome to access any of our resources. I'm looking forward to today's discussion. As I mentioned, this is very much the intersection of two great passions.
Hello, everyone. Happy May Day. And my name is Roger Duffy. I'm here today as a health and safety representative with the Canadian Union of Public Employees. We represent workers across the public sector, some 800,000 members, and people who are on the front lines delivering, healthcare, municipal services, education support staff, maintaining infrastructure and supporting communities and responding to emergencies, often under increasingly difficult and climate-driven conditions. From a QB perspective, I guess climate change is not just an abstract environmental issue or a future risk. It's already showing up to all of our members' workplaces as extreme heat, wildfire smoke, flooding, longer hours and increasing physical and psychological strains, all of which, are occupational health and safety issues. So I guess my role today is to speak to how, a worker-centered health and safety-based approach gives us practical and enforceable tools to protect workers and strengthen public services and support a fair transition in this changing climate. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and speak, and I'm glad to be a part of the discussion, especially on this May Day.
Hey, thank you. And Alex.
Thanks a lot. My name is Alex Callahan. I'm the National Director of Health, Safety and Environment at the Canadian Labour Congress, and the Canadian Labour Congress is Canada's national trade union centre. So we represent about 50 national and international unions across the country, about 3 million workers in every region and every economic sector of the Canadian economy. And I'm going to start with sort of like a little bit about why the CLC exists, because this actually sort of speaks to what we're talking about today. And anybody can go and see our Constitution. And two of the things that are in our Constitution are the right to decent work, with all the sort of commensurate labor rights that come along with that, and the right to safe work. And so the changing climate is impacting both of those things. It's both where our economy is going to have to go in order to have a productive economy as climate changes. But it's also making sure that the work that people are doing today and the work that people are going to be doing tomorrow and in 10 years and in 50 years continues to be safe, which is an ongoing fight that trade unions and that workers have. So for folks listening, today is May 1st, but just a couple of days ago was National Day of Mourning. And that's a day when workers come together and we mourn the dead and we fight for the living. And that is a big part of how this all fits together. So when we talk about health and safety, we are both mourning the dead, but we are fighting for the living. And so we are fighting for legislation and regulation and rights that protect people as the sorts of hazards that they face are changing or are being modified, or frankly, there are some novel hazards that are emerging because of climate change as well. Now, just because those things are changing doesn't mean that your approach has to change. I think we believe we have a very robust way of approaching things with an internal responsibility system and with a hierarchy of controls, and I'm sure that we're going to talk about a lot of these things, but that is That's where we're approaching this from, and this is an incredibly important issue, climate and how that intersects with health and safety. So thanks, Em, for bringing us all together today.
Really appreciate very thoughtful responses already. So my first question is for you, Anne. What are the primary risks to workers' health and safety in Canada amid the climate crisis? Some of your reporting talks about vector-borne illnesses, longer hours, heat stress, unpredictable weather, pesticides, etc. I think Roger talked about them as well. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what those look like concretely and yeah, where are we at in terms of legislative protection from those risks?
Sure. Yeah, certainly Roger and Alex mentioned some good examples already of where workers are feeling the impact of changing climate. It's not something that just started yesterday, but it's certainly something that has accelerated, I would suggest, over the past decade and will continue to do so unless concrete measures are taken. Let me just add that. So, if we start broadly speaking, climate change directly impacts workers' physical conditions, exposure risks, and their long-term well-being. Um, Workers can be exposed to extreme weather. We've seen that. We continue to see that every year. I think, we're getting into wildland fire season now. So gosh, let's hope it's not as bad as it's been over the last few years, but still a little early to tell. An unfortunately great example of extreme weather and the impact that it will have on those who fight the fires, those who work in the area, those who live in the area, etc. Um, Extreme heat or cold stress, eye and skin diseases from sun exposure, contaminated water, physical and psychosocial effects of living through a severe weather event. Many of you online may have already lived through that. There's also a greater risk of being exposed to air pollution from airborne particles and volatile organic compounds from events like wildfires. And some of those things are very, very difficult to filter out with just regular masks. Now, of course, why is that a concern? Well, pretty clearly, those types of particles can lead to cardiovascular or respiratory issues. Workers can also be exposed to animals that carry diseases and other allergens like bacteria and fungi that could lead to infectious diseases, cardiovascular issues, and other health issues. Why? Because now animals can move in a much more broader context, wild animals in particular. And whether it's domesticated or farm animals, they can be infected by some of these pathogens that perhaps didn't survive in our own climate, but now as we experience general warming trends or severe weather impacts, that shows up. Also important to think about what we might call indirect impacts to workplaces and workers. Things like musculoskeletal disorders, exposures to hazards when cleaning up from an extreme weather event, psychosocial impacts like mental stress, issues with work-life balance, eco-anxiety. These are all well documented impacts of climate change. Now, other indirect impacts can include the higher risk of hazardous conditions and emergencies in the workplace, something I would refer to as process safety. So, these conditions can arise when operating conditions or negatively impact equipment design parameters or location of the equipment. So, for example, your HVAC equipment may no longer be able to keep up with the weather extremes in your workplace. They were designed for, perhaps extreme conditions of 20 or 30 years ago, no longer appropriate, no longer adequate to provide appropriate cooling or heating. And that can also affect processes. Some processes need to be cooled. So when the equipment no longer meets those requirements, then you have failures. You have process equipment failures. You have storage tanks that are now being regularly exposed to flooding conditions, leading to tank failures. Storage tanks, when they were initially installed, many of them larger outside, weren't in flooded areas or floodplains. Here's a fun fact. Most of our Canadian flood mapping is no longer up to date. So we don't know exactly where the flooding is other than visual observation, obviously, if you work in a workplace. So all of these are very concrete examples of things that can have an impact on worker and public safety and, of course, the environment.
I want to just move to you, Roger. I had a couple questions. I want to just double move back to a conversation we had kind of off the chat a little bit earlier. You talked to me a little bit about some of the shortcomings in the occupational health regime with regards to things like heat stress and other kind of chronic health risks. Can you give me a little bit of a perspective from, the union side, and maybe you, Alex, as well, if you have thoughts on this? What are kind of some of the big shortfalls in terms of the existing workplace safety regime, as it relates to kind of climate risks? As far as I understand, there isn't actually much of a provision for heat stress at all, is there?
No, not really. Like one of the biggest concerns that we have with employers and decision makers and what is happening a lot, and I just had even mentioned just to touch base on some of that is the updating of health and safety controls. Like we've been pushing and advocating for this for decades to make sure that we have the proper controls in place and they reflect the changing climate conditions and the impacts where climate multiplies risk and hazards within our workplaces. Many employers and decision makers, they rely on hazard assessments and those things that were designed, long ago. They're not updating and getting to a point where we need to identify and prevent, a lot of these conditions from happening. A lot of our work sites, we've been, keeping members have pushed for decades to try and get there and to establish law that's not just voluntary, like the CSA voluntary developments and things that they have established already, but we've been pushing to make sure that they get up to date and bring law, regulations, and codes to a point where every reasonable precautions foreseen and hazards are addressed. We also see employers over relying on individual responsibility and our workers, telling workers to, well, just to hydrate or pace themselves or wear this PPE, like an M95 mask that, the PPE that Annie just mentioned, and maybe it's not reliable in certain situations like smoke hazards, from wildfires. There's a lot of chemicals involved. So the system level controls like adjusting staff, redesigning work, and stopping unsafe work when conditions are deteriorated or these things have got to an extreme in emergencies. Those things are not being proactively addressed and put into law and enforced. Another major issue is the lack of worker input. Our health and safety committees, and this year's the year of health and safety for QP, and we've done an awful lot of work to identify and work towards bringing our joint health and safety committees together and get them to a date to where we can get them involved completely. But Alex mentioned the IRS system earlier, and we're finding that through the internal responsibility system that our health and safety committees are not having the opportunity. They're being excluded from climate-related planning and emergency planning. And, even though like our workers are closest to the hazards and they're best positioned to identify such risks. So I mean, the employers and decision makers are missing out on this. They're missing out on an opportunity to work with those who know, which are our workers and representatives and the memberships here. So I guess in short, it's like managing the risks. They're reactive instead of proactive, and we want to see that proactivity, and workers are really paying the price for this. So especially our members in public service.
If I can just jump onto a point that Roger made, which I think is really excellent, is the idea of being proactive here instead of reactive. And so I mentioned a little earlier on about applying the hierarchy of controls. So for folks who don't spend their time thinking about health and safety, the hierarchy of controls basically says you start with trying to eliminate a hazard. Then you would try to substitute it for something else. Then you would try to engineer around it. Then you'd have administrative controls, and then the last resort is things like protective equipment, personal protective equipment. So Roger was mentioning masks, for example. So the point here is to be proactive in terms of trying to get rid of the hazard before it reaches the worker. So we're not relying on administrative or personal protective administrative controls or personal protective equipment to protect people. Basically, like saying, "Too bad, so sad. This hazard is here." So trying to apply these, or not trying to apply these, applying these proactively is how you sort of start to you make work actively you make work actively safer. And so the other part of this then is having regulations, I would say, that don't rely. So one of the fundamental rights that workers have in Canada is a right to refuse unsafe work. You can't, and that you can say, I'm not going to do this, and that institutes a work stoppage, and there's a whole process that goes around that. But the point is that when you find yourself in a situation where there is unsafe work as a function of climate, having to rely on workers to refuse unsafe work is frankly like untenable as a long-term solution. We need to have we need to have clear regulation that says when temperatures or when sort of heat is reaching or cold is reaching a certain level, there will be an automatic cessation of work. You don't have to rely on workers to say, this is too hot, I cannot do this. Or that you have air quality testing so that you're not saying, I'm coughing, I'm hacking, I'm wheezing, I can't keep doing this. There's a cessation of work before you reach that. And that frankly, when you don't have those, you rely on other principles that we have in health and safety, as low as reasonably achievable, for example, to manage hazards. Because we do have these systems, we do sort of have these architectures in place, and we need good regulations around them. We can't treat these things as inevitabilities. Like climate is big, but these hazards that come along are all things that we should be controlling. And workers are counting on employers to control. Like there is a requirement that employers control hazards in the workplace, and this is no different from any other kind of hazard. And so again, I mentioned day of mourning, like we were just talking about psychosocial hazards. That may not look like an exposed saw blade or a slip, trip, and fall hazard, but that is a hazard just like any other, and it needs to be controlled. In the same way as climate hazards may have a different sort of interpretation in the news media, in the zeitgeist, but they are workplace hazards and they need to be controlled.
In terms of, that was actually going to be my next question. So thank you so much. I was going to talk about the hackers control. I actually wanted to see if anyone would have some thoughts on the general duty clause. If someone could explain what that is and what that looks like in the context of the climate crisis. Because it occurs to me that the general duty becomes a bit frustrated when you have stochastic effects of a crisis, right? When you have, say, a vector-borne illness that is was not a risk yesterday, but it's a risk today. You have, you're putting up electrical wires or fixing electrical wires, and there's a wildfire. That one individual employer is not part of their normal risk, but it is now a general risk of doing this work in this area. So we talk about some of the problems of the general duty clause in this context. If anyone has any thoughts on that.
Sure, I'm happy to chime in on that. And before I do, I just wanted to build on both what Roger and Alex brought forward. I think one of the fundamental challenges of climate change and how workplaces respond to it is still very much seen as an environmental issue, as opposed to an issue that impacts every single worker, perhaps differently for every single worker in a workplace. But oftentimes I've seen climate change reduced to, reduce, recycle, reuse type of thing. I mean, this is not that. Right? We're past that. And it's a bad PR campaign for climate change in the workplace, but honestly, it is just frustrating to for folks that just do not get what climate change impacts mean to workers and workplaces, that it is not an environmental issue. It is a societal, it is a fundamental workplace health and safety issue now and into the future. Okay, so that being said, I'll get off my soapbox now. Um, the general duty clause. So it is kind of, I'll call it the catch-all health and safety regulatory clause, if you will. So essentially, what the general duty clause says, employers must take measures to maintain a healthy and safe workplace. Now, I mean, reasonably speaking, I don't think every single um, regulation or act is going to cover every possible hazard. And, sometimes the general duty clause is used for emerging issues until there's a little bit more knowledge, and all of a sudden you've got a more regulatory specific aspect that's brought forward. And I think that may be where climate change goes down the road. At this point, I would suggest that climate change issues by and large, would be captured under the general duty clause. So I mentioned that, it's the employer's responsibility to take measures to maintain a healthy and safe workplace. So it does put the onus and the responsibility on the employer. And so when you think about that, you also need to think about what does due diligence mean, right? Due diligence is a pretty well-known approach, if you will, defense in many cases for whether it's environmental issues or health and safety issues. Due diligence really talks about whether you've used a more than not just a reasonable level, but something that is consistent with good industrial practice, if we're talking about industry, regarding care, prudence, the determination and activity that a person could reasonably expected to do under the circumstances. So when you apply that to occupational health and safety, due diligence means that employers have to take all precautions that are reasonable under the circumstances to prevent injuries or incidents in the workplaces. Because of the general duty clause, due diligence applies to all workplace situations, even when they're not specifically addressed in occupational health and safety legislation. So you see, I mentioned initially that it was kind of, the general duty clause is a little bit catch-all right now. I can see the time down the road where there may be more specific regulations that speak to how controls are for, or how to control the impacts of climate change in your specific workplace. But I think at this point, we're not there. But regardless, and this is something that I think all of us have said already, what would have been considered duly diligent 10 or 20 years ago, it just may not be appropriate anymore given the changing climate conditions. So I think we need to continually reevaluate what does due diligence mean and how does that function in the context of the general duty clause, which, coming back to the employer, the onus is on the employer to provide a safe and healthy workplace.
I think it's worth adding that like the consideration of what these hazards actually mean for workers is like it's a subject of disagreement with employers on lots of times. So like it is covered by the general duty clause, but having good regulation and having something
Yeah.
that's slightly broader in legislation is really important because how much of this is just sort of considered like, well, suck it up, this is just kind of how it goes. Um, we've talked about thermal stress and it often gets talked about for outdoor workers.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just an issue for outdoor workers.
100%.
And I'll give you an example. I can see out my window, I can see my kids' school. And they got a lot of big windows and they mostly face south. And what happens is, come summertime, those classrooms are getting like above 30 degrees Celsius. It is unbelievably hot. And so there's a worker who is not outdoors. They're not on a road crew. Um, and and but there is thermal stress that's happening. Like that is they're unreasonably hot classrooms. Never you mind that there are students in these classrooms as well. In the same way as when British Columbia was in the middle of a heat dome, and office buildings, which have never had air conditioning before because it's British Columbia and never gets too hot, never gets too cold, were all of a sudden unreasonably hot, and that presented a workplace hazard. But they were not working outside in the beating hot sun; they were in an office building,
Right.
and so what sort of constitutes like just sort of what employers will say is part of the job versus what workers will say is unsafe work. It is, you're right, like it is there's a way in which it's covered by general duty clauses, but it's still an area I think where we need to have a recognition of hazards that are like often it's a hazard that exists and then is sort of modified or exacerbated by climate.
And it gets into the building code, right?
Mhm.
I mean, you look at what are the building code standards for things like care facilities, whether it's seniors facilities or, any kind of care facility where we've seen it happen in Quebec. It's well documented in other provinces as well, where both workers have become very, very ill. Those in care have died as a result of inadequate building standards, some of which, well, some buildings were never updated even to building code standards. That's a different story. But those building code standards just aren't set for today's climate conditions.
If I could just chime in there too as well, like I mean, just back to what I had mentioned earlier, like and Alex just kind of summed it up very well as well, that there's a clear recognition that climate change modifies or multiplies existing workplace hazards, and the responsibility there is just like Annie had mentioned, is the employer's responsibility under health and safety legislation to protect workers, and these laws and these occupational health and safety laws are pretty explicit when it comes to that and account for changes that come with severity and frequency and distribution of hazards caused by climate conditions. So those like heat and smoke and flooding and everything that we had mentioned earlier. But I mean, emergency preparedness plans, they must also be reviewed against, current projected climate changes and realities and not the historical norms, like I mentioned earlier, and what we have seen. We need legislated just transition frameworks that look at climate action so it doesn't come at the expense of workers and our members and their income, job security, or pensions, et cetera. Like QP and workers and unions, like we must have a voice in planning those transitions as well, and members. And when it comes to that duty that you had mentioned earlier, it's important that we're seen as a part of it, and that our membership have an active voice there. You know, it's overall, like I mean, QP, we push for such investments in climate resilient infrastructures, and that's critical. Like Annie had mentioned, and the buildings and reliable ventilation and flood protections and resilient public services that really go and protect both workers and communities and everyone at all. Um, but the primary responsibility here is that of the employers, and the decision makers should be making decisions that are proactive and result in better results that would overall look at the climate impacts from a reality perspective.
I think also, if I can just build on some of your thoughts, Roger, and I think you're in Newfoundland, if I'm not mistaken, right? Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, think about what happened in Port aux Basques not many years ago. What about 5 or 6 years ago when a hurricane came through, basically devastated the community. So yes, we all have emergency response plans, but those response plans are not set for absolute devastation. Some people will die, perhaps, but others remain. But they try to fight and try to react to this extreme weather event when their homes are gone, when their families have to move on. So that is a whole different dimension to workplace emergency response that, again, coming back to updating of our own documents within workplaces and having, as Alex, you've said, and I think it's a very good point, making sure that response plans, whether it's through legislation, whether it's through standards, regulatory changes, that there really is an appropriate checklist to say, are you in an area? Are you in Tornado Alley in southwestern Ontario, for example? Do your response plans address what might happen in your workplace, and how are you going to recover from it, and how are you going to take care of the, people? You can't assume that people who you think would be the usual responders are going to be available, because they want to take care of their families as well. So, these are things that are becoming more and more frequent, more and more severe. And I would suggest that our current approaches just no longer address adequately how to prepare for severe weather events, how our building codes are being updated. I know there's a lot of discussion going on that, but my goodness, updating codes just seems to take forever. Um, and many will not update a building until they see it's a natural requirement, which is really unfortunate.
It's a responsibility on employers, but there's a responsibility around decision makers and those individuals that um, should view this. This is this is urgent. It's here. It's present, and we see those factors like in Port of Aston, Newfoundland, and Annie had mentioned. And one of the biggest lessons that we should have learned, and those decision makers should learn, I think our duty should be, um, is that we learned through COVID. I mean, QP and many of us have been warning since 2003 of the implications and these things that are coming from SARS, potential emergencies that will outbreak. We developed numerous numerous resources and kits and ways and regulatory forms in which we could have prevented and acted in a way that wasn't so severe. And COVID is a great example that we were well prepared and workers provided an awful lot of information, whereas those with the duty weren't prepared or proactive, and they shut down the country, and shut down a lot of work sites. And here we had emergency workers within the buildings. I mean, that proactive approach and the duty overall, like, I mean, from employers, but it's also a duty from decision makers, those that are well above. They should know.
Really helpful. I want to just talk a little bit about. This reminds me actually about the question within the hierarchy of controls. You have the option of like substituting kind of unsafe work. Now, one of the problems I think that, and this connects to kind of one of the shortcomings of a lot of occupational health and safety regimes, is that they operate from workplace to workplace, not that there isn't a general regime of planning for health across workplaces. So, spills from one factory that impact another, or air pollutants, that it's health planning within one work site. And that becomes a bit of a problem when you're looking at general problems. I guess what I was looking at is, what role does kind of industrial policy play in mitigating risks, or what role could it play in mitigating general health risks, right? Like when you think about, a couple of years ago when like a train derailed and caused a big bunch of chemical fumes that were endangering a bunch of communities in the American Midwest, you can say, well, like, there's an obligation of the employers in that area, and I think that's legitimate, not to require workers to work in those fumes. But there does eventually have to be a question of, when we're planning around mitigating environmental hazards, to say, like, okay, we got to stop having privatized rail companies kill people and dump toxins into our air and water, right? That eventually comes down to a generalized responsibility. And I think this dovetails a little bit with what sorry, this is a long question, but Alex, your organization, the CLC, during your Earth Day memo, you wrote that the hazards posed by climate change, including heat stress and extreme weather events, are impossible to ignore, thereby underscoring the urgency of collective action to meet the moment. I guess where do you see the role of kind of political activity and general kind of empowerment of communities in providing kind of a collective response to collective risks?
Wow, nice, simple question, Em. There's a lot in there.
Go
Um,
for it, Alex.
yeah, sure. Okay. I'm gonna pull a couple things out of there, and then you can you can tell me to go back to coloring inside the lines. So you were talking a little bit about industrial strategy and I would say this, a worker-led and a worker-focused industrial strategy would be, I think, one way that communities would be sort of expressing a voice about where we want to go. So the CLC has been consistently calling for basically like a green industrial strategy, an industrial strategy for net zero, whatever you want to call it, as a way of articulating what we need to do with our economy that will allow us to meet targets and support and create good jobs. So maybe a sort of a starting point is like, so what's an industrial strategy? Okay, so like 1963, John Kennedy says we're going to go to the moon by the end of the decade and do the other things too. That's like that's like the thing you want to do. And then you have to build an industrial strategy that says, okay, so we're going to create a regulatory regime for how we, I don't know, build rockets, and we're going to put money into post-sec so that we have PhDs. We're going to be doing massive procurements of computers so that we can do all the things that go along with how you build a rocket ship that's going to go to the moon. So in a similar way, we've said we want to meet these climate targets. And so what do we do with our economy to get there? We have regulatory supports in certain areas. We have investments in training. The government is going to procure goods and services in these other areas that are going to say this is sort of the economy that we want to have. And in a lot of ways, that is dealing with the root cause of climate change, with our emissions, which sort of is a cause of these hazards. The other thing, though, is I think you can have industrial strategy that speaks to some of the hazards that are kind of this sort of snowball effect of climate change. So you made passing reference, M, to fires. So one of the things that happens as there's more and more wildland firefighting is the kinds of chemicals that are used in fighting forest fires. There's PFAS chemicals that can be involved in both the turnout gear and in the additives that you basically put on the fire. I'm not an expert in firefighting, as you can probably tell, but that's a toxic chemical. It's a SEPA toxic chemical now. So having industrial strategy that says we're going to invest R&D and we're going to put effort into having firefighting foams that don't have PFAS in them, that we will be making goods in this country that firefighters can use for their turnout gear that will not, because we're going to have more wildland firefighters, that will meet the needs of wildland firefighters that don't have toxic chemicals in them. This is, I think, part of a much broader sort of discussion that we could have about how industrial strategy can help support sort of overall health and safety. Like we could have I'm sure, a very good substantive discussion about the need for properly fitting PPE for people of all different shapes and sizes. But there are ways in which this ties directly into climate. And I'm not entirely sure that I have actually answered the question that you posed, Em, but I have certainly done my best to pull out a couple pieces and riff on them.
I think that answers it pretty well. It's a question of when you're talking about substituting hazards, there becomes the question of like, well, what are the substitutes at a certain point? And that ultimately does come down to a political question, economic one. Roger, you talked to
And a
me
regulatory one, because
on a
we say we will
regulatory
not have
one.
these kinds of hazards in our economy anymore. We're gonna, that's an elimination, actually.
Yeah. And Roger, I think we talked a little bit about more that on the trade union side, which is that part of the ability of workers to fight for substitutes, to fight for their protections, also requires their empowerment in the workplace. And I guess, what's the kind of work that you see in terms of particularly unions, and particularly the public sector, in, providing space not just for workers to protect themselves at work, but also for communities to protect themselves from these sorts of hazards?
So you mean from an advocacy role? I guess, like, to answer that question, I guess it would come from existing like health and safety tools that QP's approach would come from, and the resources, and um, you know, we look at the tools that we make climate risk more enforceable and not optional. Uh, Bargaining, activists, in a daily practice, like we kind of treat climate impacts like heat and smoke and flooding and those things as workplace hazards, and they're identified and assessed at the workplace level and controlled under the hierarchy of controls, which Alex had mentioned earlier. Um, that means privatizing and elimination, and the engineering controls like ventilation and cooling, and a lot of things that we get into in our committees, and in our union local committees that actually get into in order to address changes, and in order to make those proper changes, like advocacy, like through green bargaining that we talked about. I mean, QP has a environmental policy, and we've established that since 2011 through convention and democratic processes of our membership, and resolution of national conventions. So, we support locals who negotiate language on all those hazards like heat stress and air quality and staffing levels, and anything during emergencies or workload protections. And joint environment climate committees that we have, and at those levels. Um, we're turning those provisions from climate safety into enforceable rights under collective agreements.
And from
Maybe
Alex,
if
And
I
we also
can,
support workers who, through health and safety committees like inspections and work refusals, and climate conditions create real danger. And you mentioned with your question earlier about for Alex was, cross contamination or climate impacts into the workplace from one workplace to another, and those conditions are real danger. So the advocacy and community work, and the provisions there that we advocate for publicly, and it changes the health and safety laws and helps clarify for employers that you must update your hazards and controls, um, and climate risks that are evolving. So. Um, I can't speak from an advocacy side. I'm a staff member, but yeah, they're basically from a health and safety perspective. That's the type of advocacy that we do work towards within our communities, our locals, at a local level.
I wonder if I can maybe offer some thoughts on that, Em.
yeah,
Certainly not. Our organization isn't an advocacy organization either, but so I'll just speak more from a personal perspective. But when you look at particularly smaller communities, I mean, this applies in larger communities as well, but where my point, which I will get to eventually, is in smaller communities, who shows up when there's something happens, whether it's a wildland fire, whether it's an industrial spill, whether it's who knows what, whether a tank has failed because of flooding, who shows up? It's the first responders. And who are the members of first response teams, both within the workplace or public responders, typically are unionized members. And I see that as an avenue, absent regulatory intervention, if you will, of having collaboration very much at the community level, where first responders, hopefully through their management, can reach out to those organizations, those industries in the community, and let's have an open and honest conversation about what are the issues in your workplace. And so that we're better prepared collectively as a community, collectively as a first response community, and as an industry, because then the local industry will know what kind of supports can I truly count on in situations that I may never have faced since this organization was set up in this community. So I'm just looking at it from a little bit different perspective, that there should be the ability, um, absent regulatory willpower, if you will, to make specific regulations where communities can still collaborate and identify what are those hazardous conditions. Ideally, the employer learns as well, right? About, oh, have you thought about this? Have you thought about where that tank is located? How old is it? Is it subject to failure in the next 5 to 10? They're not accusatory questions. They're questions that come from looking at things from a different lens and helping people think and realize what are the hazards that they might face in their workplace.
And I think this is an interesting way to sort of uh, the question that you've asked actually takes us back to the nub of like where the idea of a just transition came from, because it actually didn't start around climate. It started around like toxic cleanup sites. And so what had happened was in the United States, there was a steel worker named Tony Mazzocchi who, in the course of his work, they were seeing that the kinds of things that were a hazard in the workplace that were making workers sick were also a hazard in the community. And that the workers who were doing that work, it was harming them, it was harming the community, and that needed to stop, but that they didn't make that decision to do that. That was the decision of their employer, and there was an obligation on the part of the employer, and that these communities saw to create good long-term jobs that were safe for in terms of their occupational health and safety, but safe also in terms of like the long-term health of their community. But that those were good jobs. This couldn't be a way for employers to sacrifice the quality of jobs and say you've gone from this, good unionized job to like, with a job that maybe is cleaner but has poor protections, has less of a paycheck. You see your pension evaporate. You don't have the same sorts of rights to collective bargaining, that your joint committee doesn't have the power that it had previously. And that this question about like where health and safety and these big sort of like larger environmental issues come together is what the whole question of just transition is about. And saying that this has to then be rooted in good jobs and in decent work, for people going forward.
And just to mention, like one of the key things for health and safety, like and for CUPE and for us and for membership within CUPE and the worker at the worker level is the importance of collaborating with the employer and advocating with the employer through joint health and safety committees and its regulatory and their regulatory committees at the work site. And, through that internal responsibility system where we function and advocate uh, to put forward the right tools and to address the authority measures that are there. And it's important that inspections, physical and psychological inspections, whatever the case may be, psychosocial, that third advocacy that really takes part from our workers, and that it's important that climate aspects are addressed and looked at and seen at that time and brought forward. So I mean, the education component for membership and understanding, where we want to be proactive and how we want to be proactive at the worker center level, brings it to the community level and to the employer level at site.
And what a novel concept. Community Health and Safety Committee built with representatives from around the community, whether it's the industrial sector, unions, community first responders, etc. And why does it exist? It exists so that we all have a community at the end of the day that thrives and survives some of these very, very significant challenges.
And I think personally, a personal opinion, I think that from an environmental perspective and climate action perspective and at the work site and for workers and for members is that it would be very interesting to see how environment enforcement and regulation, similar to the occupational health and safety regulation, how that could be harmonized to address nationally, uh, allow that community interaction along with employer and worker. Be an interesting concept for sure.
I just want to talk a little bit about be a bit more ideological because it is May Day. One thing that's often said, and you mentioned the principle of community health, is that doctors can prescribe medication, but they can't prescribe decent work, housing, and that's one of the limitations and it is a major strain on the health system. But also occurs to me that that is also one of the principles of the labor movement is actually to guarantee those things and to fight for those things. And I think, Alex, you had the slogan, mourn the dead, fight like hell for the living. Um, and we have an upcoming episode of the podcast with someone from IBW talking about the question of, union-led industrial policy. But I guess to kind of wrap up, what role do you see labor playing in, a just transition? And I think what I think I really liked about this discussion is that we've centered this not in terms of kind of justice commitments or a question of like environmental responsibility, reuse and recycle as you said, but actually in terms of a fight for well-being. Can we talk a little bit about that connection and how this kind of environmental safety actually grows out of workplace safety? So I don't know if anyone wants to connect those dots and speak thematically about that.
Well, I can tell you, I'm going to circle back to where I started, which is like in the Constitution of the Canadian Labour Congress is safe work and decent work, and part of that is making sure that that is safe and decent work for decades to come. So this is a fundamental keystone. How's that for two? For mixing my metaphors. Um, but it is a keystone to the kind of work that we do. And it's going to always be a focus of the work that we do, that we need to have good work, that it is safe, and that it is the kind of work that people can count on for their lives, that these things are, and when I say for their lives, I mean like these are like people are fighting for the kind of career that they can have for as long as they want. Um, and that is something that unions have fought for. Unions will continue to fight for to make work safer, and that's everything from unions who are going to decide to strike over these things, to fighting for regulation, to lobbying for legislation, to working on the international fora for this. So. Anne made a plug earlier on. I will also just note for anybody who's interested that the ITUC, of which we're a member, the International Trade Union Confederation, uh, the thematic for Day of Mourning, which they call the International Workers' Memorial Day, in 2024 was around climate hazards. And there's a lot of work that is being done on these issues it doesn't always sort of present as climate work. It presents as health and safety work. But there is an intimate tie between these two things, and they are going to be a keystone for as long as unions are doing work, I would say.
And I would add to that, I think in keeping watch of what's happening in the EU in particular is very, very interesting in this area. I participated in, I want to say 2024, maybe late 2023, in a session that was focused on the psychosocial and psychological impact of climate change. And you really wouldn't see something like that here. Maybe now, maybe in a few years. We've been touching on it at CCOHS, but there were considerable numbers of experts who came together from around Europe to just speak about psychosocial impact of climate change. And I think that bears watching closely what comes out of their efforts.
Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. I think very wide ranging, and I think it really, thread the connection that's often a bit more tenuous in these areas. So I thank all of our panelists. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope people will enjoy it on the podcast as well when it goes out.
Yeah. Thank you for having us.
Great seeing you, Anne. Great seeing you, Roger.
Likewise.
Nice seeing you, Alex. See you.
Class and Climate is hosted by myself, M, and produced by Clement Nokos. It was edited by Jack McClelland. Class and Climate, Perspectives on a Green Economy is a joint project of the Green Economy Network and the Broadband Institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or leave a review on the Perspectives Journal podcast on all major podcast platforms, and share it with someone you know. And subscribe to Press Progress's award-winning Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadband Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca. And get more from the Broadband Institute by subscribing to our mailing list at broadbandinstitute.ca/subscribe.